Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk about the biology of stress. This, of course, is a little technical subject. So if you are one of those persons who hasn't had much of biology in your educational system, then this video may be a little bit challenging. But I promise you that it's not going to be overwhelming because I will keep things as simple as possible. Hey, we are not here to become biologists or to become physicians, right? The primary reason we are getting into the biology of stress is because we want a better understanding of how stress occurs in our body, how stress manifests in our body, and what are some of the mechanisms through which our body gets stressed. And it is important to understand this because it has important implications on what we typically do to manage our stress and what are some of the more effective ways to manage our stress. So that's the primary reason why we are getting into the biology of stress. So with that introduction, let's delve into the biology. So at a very broad overview level, stress affects almost our entire body. We have already discussed that when you are stressed over a period of time, it ends up affecting your body in a way that it starts getting diseased. In fact, that was what we discussed in the general adaptation syndrome that was propounded by Hans Selye. So in here, what we see is a summary of some of the ways that our body responds to chronic stress. So we may have chronic fatigue, so we feel like we don't have much energy. Of course, headaches, attention deficits, we having then anxiety, we tend to become irritable, anger, panic disorders. So a lot of these are at a psychological level, but even at a physiological level, we may start grinding our teeth. We may start getting tension in our jaw, so the lock jaw syndrome, those kind of issues may start developing over a period of time. A lot of the heart related problems happen again because of chronic stress: heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, strokes. We may start developing digestive problems because, again, if you remember, the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system that I had briefly touched upon before. So during stress, our parasympathetic nervous system is dampened. So our digestive system is not functioning optimally. So if we are in chronic states of stress, then over a period of time, our digestive system takes a heavy toll. So we are not being able to digest things properly. And just the opposite actually happens with respect to the heart. The sympathetic nervous system is on an overdrive there. So again, even that takes a toll on our heart because our heart is a muscle, right? So if any muscle, if it is always strained, it is always, then after a point of time, it will not be able to relax appropriately, which essentially is in a very layman's language how we develop hypertension or higher blood pressure. Through some complex mechanisms, which again I will touch upon, stress leads to obesity, leads to weight gain. Your sex drive starts decreasing. Not just the sex drive, in fact, you can get impotent. And in case of women, this could lead to you not being able to bear children. Again, I will discuss the mechanisms through which some of these things happen. But it is important, right, to understand some of these effects. Otherwise, we will not take stress seriously. So, of course, in my last lecture, I told you that we have to make stress work for us. But again, I also mentioned there, it's not about being blind about the negative impact of stress. So once we are very accurate in our understanding of stress and how it impacts our body, then we can make certain tweaks that will help us manage stress, that will help us make it work for us. So with respect to muscles also, you may have a stiff body and muscle tension, fibromyalgia, having different kind of pain in your body. And of course, lot of behavioral issues happen as well. Alcoholism, addiction of different types, those things impact. Then we have sleep disorders, insomnia. We have our immune system, immune system problems. Sometimes it gets dampened, sometimes it gets gets into an overdrive. So all kinds of issues happen when we are chronically stressed. We know, of course, stress in the short term is helpful because it helps us survive in a dangerous situation. So, but this was just the overview of how stress is affected, or stress affects our body rather. So now we will go into a little bit more detail. So before I go there, we have to touch upon two important systems when we are talking about the effect of stress on our body. One is the nervous system. So the electrical system, essentially, the parallel would be the electrical system, because the nervous system communicates over electrical impulses. And then our body also responds chemically, so which is the endocrine system, which is the system of hormones, which also impact our stress, as well as stress impacts our hormones. So we will touch upon these two systems primarily. Of course, other systems do get affected, but these are the two primary systems that are integrally related with stress. So these are the two systems that we will be talking about. We will first start with the nervous system. Now, before we go into the depths of the nervous system, you must have seen many of these zombie movies, right? Typically what happens in these zombie movies, some virus infects these people, which then turns them into zombies. And these zombies, they can't think straight anymore. They do not recognize you as a human being with values, with emotions, and they are either very angry, like the rage virus that is talked about in I Am Legend, and or they are really hungry. So they lose, these zombies, they lose the discriminating power, essentially, right? And they attack you. Now, of course, these are works of fiction, but the reason I wanted to start with this analogy is because when we get stressed, essentially what also happens, of course at a much milder level, our emotions essentially hijack our thinking part of the brain. So we may then lose the discriminating power that our conscious thinking brain has. And this then can have impact on how effectively we function on our jobs, in our personal lives, in the society, and so on and so forth, right? So we will now discuss the anatomy of the nervous system and how it is related to stress. So especially when discussing the nervous system, there are a lot of emotions involved, but I want to just mention this also, that the emotion that has been studied the most is the fear system. And it is in a way very primal system, because it is related to a lot of other more complex emotions like anxiety, stress, anger, jealousy. Because again, what happens in fear? You are fearful of a threat and your body responds in a certain way, right? To either fight or flee from that danger. So most of the research that, or at least the initial research that has happened in the field, focused on the emotion fear, because that emotion then is related to some of the other complex emotions that we typically associate with stress. And it is, in fact, the root of a lot of disorders, psychological disorders as well. So, if we are talking about our brain, and not just human brain, even any animal brain, there are essentially three parts. Or the central nervous system has four parts that would include the spinal cord. So all animals will have the brain. Okay, this is the brain, and the brain will have these three regions. The hind brain, which is technically called the rhombencephalon. Cephalon refers to the brain. So the hind brain typically controls some of the basic functions that are essential for your survival. So your breathing, your heart running properly, your digestion happening, all these basic functions. You don't even have to think about it. So for example, you don't have to think about breathing. If our breathing depended only on our conscious thinking, then we would all be long dead, right? If our heartbeat was dependent upon our conscious thinking part of the brain, then again we would be dead when we are asleep, right? Because we are not thinking about making our heart pump then. So the hind brain is that part of the brain which controls a lot of these basic mechanisms that are essential for any organism's survival. Then there is the midbrain, which is also in many ways related to our basic survival, but it adds a little bit more complexity, the emotional aspect, the survival aspect. Survival to threat kind of aspects, those things do start coming into the picture. So the upward we go, the more complexity we will see in the brain. And finally we have the forebrain, which is called the prosencephalon. Now that is typically the conscious thinking part of the brain. Now these are very broad generalizations that I'm making. So this is the side view here. So this will be the front part of the face, and this is the back. So this is the our frontal cortex, and the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the spinal cord. So these are the three major parts of brain in all animals. Now, so we are talking right now about the central nervous system. Central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So what is the basic function of our nervous system? What is the basic function? Even the nervous system of a worm has this basic same function. So there are sensory nerves. So that when we are talking about sensory nerves, we are talking about, in human beings especially, we are talking about the peripheral nervous system. So we have a lot of nerves spread throughout our body, right? And those nerves, they bring in sensation, which then through the spinal cord, those sensory nerves bring the information to the brain, and the brain processes that information, okay, and then sends direction again to our extremities about what we need to do. So in case of this worm, if you put some obstacle here so that the worm cannot move forward, so this worm sensed this obstacle, maybe through its eyes or whatever sensory method it has, and then that information goes to the brain registers that information and then sends direction through the motor nerves to the extremities about, okay, now you need to move left to bypass this obstacle, right? And this is what is happening at a most basic level. But you understand this happens also with human beings, right? I see a scary dog, so that's the sensory information that's coming through my eyes. It reaches my brain, and not only do I see the scary dog, this dog is growling, so I even hear it. So again, through my hearing senses, I receive the information about a angry, scary dog, and my brain then processes that information. So integration of that information is happening. So I may have past memories of some scary dogs. Maybe I would have seen that in some movie about how a scary dog rips apart some person, or some horror movie, right? So I match the information that I'm getting through my sensory nerves with the existing information that I have. So I'm integrating it, and then my brain then sends directions to the motor nerves. Hey, you have to run away from this. This dog is too big. You can't fight it. It's better that you start running, or maybe if it is relatively small, I have a chance of fighting it or whatever, then I may decide to fight it. But whatever. So my brain makes this decision. It directs those decision to my limbs, and then I take the necessary step. So a lot of complex processes are happening in fractions of a second here, but this is how things are happening here. So this is exactly what I was talking about. When we are talking about the central nervous system, we talk about the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so that's all we are talking about. And then when we are talking about the peripheral nervous system, we are talking about all the nerves that goes into the extremities. So that's the peripheral nervous system. You don't have to understand or remember any of these specific nerves. You don't need to. So that's way beyond the scope of this class, for that matter, even beyond my scope to even understand, because again, I'm not a neurologist. So now we will very briefly touch upon the nerve cell, which is the neuron, right? So neurons have the cell body, which is this part of the nerve cell. So which has its nucleus, which has the DNA and everything, and it has these extending parts which are called dendrites. Dendrites collect electrical signals from other adjacent neurons, and then these electrical signals will get transmitted through the axon. Axon is this stem portion, and then finally in axon terminal, again it gets sent to the extremities, this electrical signals. The axon can be really long. For some axons can run into several feet in our body, because they originate from the brain, and it may run through the entire spinal cord. So these can be really long, running into 1, 2, 3 feet. I don't know the exact longest, but they can be really long cells. Now, this axon part of the nerve cell, that is covered by what is called Schwann cells, okay, which provide what is called the myelin sheath. You may have heard of myelin sheath. Because this tends to be a little whiter in color, this myelination, it's made out of fat cells. So they tend to be covered with myelin sheath. This part ultimately leads to what we call as the white matter part of the brain, and this cell body forms the gray matter part of the brain. So before I go there, so this Schwann cells, they are not connected throughout. They are separated by these nodes, which are called the nodes of Ranvier. But what it does is it helps speeden up the signals. So when electrical signals or whatever information through electrical signals, because all communication is happening through electrical signals, right? When they get communicated from this cell body to the axon terminal here, this can go extremely fast. I'm forgetting the exact number, some even 100 meters per second, or maybe to that even faster. So and in some cases, that speed with which the information travels is extremely important, right? And why is that? Because especially when we have danger in front of us, our body has to react really fast. For some other types of axon, maybe the information doesn't have to move as fast, right? But especially when it comes to danger, this has to move really fast. So the myelin sheath, these fat cells, it speeds up the rate at which the signal moves through the entire neuron. So this is what we need to understand, because again, it has implications on stress and stress management and the damages that happen to our brain. So I will talk about that in a bit. So this is the human brain, right? So if we cut the brain, this way, so this is how we see the brain. So these folds that we see here, the outside, okay, that is a little darker in color because it has those cells. Remember the dendrite, the cell body, the entire cell body. So essentially what's happening is, so here we have the cell body, okay, with its dendrites and the axon of each of those nerve cells. So the axon is covered in, remember, the fat cells. So that is lighter in shade. That's the reason the white matter part of the brain, that is nothing but these axons. Okay, the axon part of the brain, which is the myelinated part of the brain. So, and these so-called gray matter, that's the cell body of these neurons. Now, the gray matter typically is associated with thinking, with much more. Again, I'm making broad generalizations here because this will vary by the area of the brain. So right now we are talking in very broad generalizations. But typically it does a lot of this processing. Lot of that mental processing is happening in this gray matter by the cells because it has many more the parts, the nucleus, and all the other subparts of the neuron cell. So whereas the axon is primarily responsible for relaying of that information as fast as possible, depending on the nature of that information, right? So both in terms of information going to these gray matter areas, both, that is sensory information as well as motor information. Sensory information is the information that comes from our extremities, from our sense organs to our brain, and motor neurons or motor processing means information going from our brain to our body parts for the necessary action, right? So actions are all the actions combined, they form these white matter part of the brain. So that essentially processes the speed at which information moves. So now here's something that we can talk in context of how stress, prolonged stress, can change essentially the structure of our brain. So this is something that they have seen in PTSD patients, for example, that their white matter area increases. Okay, so this then creates an imbalance of the percentage of gray matter versus white matter, and you can understand why their white matter area increases, because they, again, it not for the entire brain, but essentially for certain parts of the brain, they want to detect danger even faster than what would be considered normal in normal human beings. So how can you detect even danger even faster than normal? That is when there is more myelination in these axon cells, right? So that's the reason what happens is that you end up getting more white matter than gray matter. So and this percentage is very important here. So again, let me give an analogy. In terms of brain size, the blue whale's brain will be much higher, bigger than that of the human brain, or the elephant's brain is going to be bigger than our human brain. But it is not so. Does that make then the blue whale or the elephant a more intelligent animal than us human beings? No, because it is not so much about the size of the brain, but the proportion. So compared to the rest of the body, how big is our brain, right? That's the analogy. Similarly, so if the proportion of gray matter decreases in contrast to white matter, that then creates a lot of problems. Similar kind of analogy here. So now we will delve into the main parts of the brain. So as I have already mentioned, let's see. Where was that? Oh, here. We had the midbrain, we had the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. So the same things are here. We have the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Okay. Now we are delving a little deeper now, where we are talking about some individual parts within these main parts of the brain. So the cortex part is the gray matter, and cerebral cortex is something, this outside part of the brain. And when we are talking about the cortex in the frontal region, that is called the prefrontal cortex. I think I have a diagram for that, but we will touch upon that later. So let's talk about the midbrain and hindbrain. I did tell you that this controls some of the basic functioning that is essential for our survival. So that's what this midbrain and hindbrain combined, they are also known as the brain stem. Okay, this part is called as the brain stem. So they control breathing, circulation, digestion, and they are also routing information from the spinal cord, or through the spinal cord. They carry information to the other parts of the brain, the cortex, right? So let's do the eraser so that we have a little bit clarity now. Okay. So that's the brain stem, the midbrain, hindbrain. So this is also called as the reptilian part of the brain. So even like reptiles, a snake or an alligator, that those organisms may not have complex reasoning abilities like we human beings do. But even in the most primitive of the brains, you will see this brain stem, which would control breathing, circulation, digestion, and information bringing in and sending out the motor information. So you will see this even in the most primitive part of the brain. Now, in here there is another part which is towards the rear part of our brain. Okay, inside, underneath the rear part of our brain. That is called the cerebellum. Now, this part of the brain, it has multiple functions, but one of the functions is that it gives coordination to our body. So a lot of movement and motor memory. So we remembering to move our body in certain ways. Cerebellum is not the only part that does this, which you will get to know in a bit, but it plays a crucial role. In fact, the proper balance of our body, everything that's controlled by the cerebellum, through of course the inner ear, which has the mechanisms for us to have better balance. But ultimately, this motor memory, a large part of it gets stored in the cerebellum. And if the cerebellum gets damaged or is affected, then we tend to see a lot of problems. We tend to see such people then having less of motor coordination. They may not be having proper balance. And because the cerebellum also has to do with attention, so they may not be able to attend to, or they may not be able to be attentive. So they may easily get distracted. They will have difficulty focusing their attention. And again, partly, if not completely, the language part is also processed to a certain extent by cerebellum. So if your cerebellum again is damaged, then you will not be able to process language properly. You will not be able to speak fluently. So these are some of the problems that happens. And now this is interesting because we now will relate these things to stress. What happens is that there are certain syndromes like the Shamans Syndrome, also known as the Cerebellar Cognitive Affective Syndrome, where the cerebellum is actually affected, due to which we see problems in with planning, lowered verbal fluency, inattention, impulsiveness, long-term depression. But you tend to see the same symptoms somewhere else too. People who are addicted to alcohol. And you know that many people try to cope with stress by drinking alcohol. But, when you are drinking alcohol, you are then not being able to think as straight. You have slurred speech. You are not being attentive, and you stumble while you're walking. Some of the same symptoms, right, that you see at a much severe level when you have the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. But this then gives us some idea that, hey, this is not a wise thing to take alcohol when we are stressed, because what is happening is that we are essentially damaging the cerebellum part of our brain, which is so critical to our proper motor coordination, to our motor memory, to our attention, to our verbal fluency. So I hope you understand the connection here. Even though there may be a urge to drink alcohol, because it temporarily it dampens your stress. You don't feel as stressed temporarily, at least. So now we will come to this So beyond the brain stem, now we will come to the main part of the brain, the cortex, and the inside, the underneath. So the cortex is surrounding the brain, and in between, beneath, is what is called the limbic system. We will get into details of the limbic system, but we will now start with some of the more foundational organs. One is the thalamus. So thalamus is, it's a, like dome shape kind of organ that is in the middle of the brain, essentially, if you can visualize that. So that works like the relay center. It all the information that is coming from through our spinal cord, from these peripheral nerves, it through the spinal cord, it comes to thalamus. Thalamus decides, the relevance of that information. Is it related to our physical movement? Is it related to understanding language? Is it related to making sense of some visual stimulus? Based on that, it relays the information accordingly. It may either send it to the back, which is the occipital lobe, or some complex problem solving, which then it will be to the frontal lobe, and so on and so forth. Or here for some motor actions meaning your physical movement, right? Well, it will actually first send it to the somatosensory part, and then from there it will go to the motor cortex. But in any case, the thalamus acts like this router, this relay center that sends information wherever it's needed. And it also controls partly our sleep and wakefulness, which again should make sense to you, because again, when we are stressed, many of us either tend to oversleep or we start losing sleep, especially if we have our stress over a long period of time. We start getting insomnia, right? So because our thalamus is overactive, it is constantly sending those signals. Even if there is no real danger in front of us, for instance, it is constantly sending signals and essentially keeping ourselves awake. Some of those dangers may be our own thinking, our own thought pattern, but that's then keeping us awake. So below this thalamus is what is called hypothalamus. Hypo means lower, hyper means above, right? So, or more. Hypo means less. So it's not exactly less of a thalamus, but it is below the thalamus. That's the reason it is called hypothalamus, because it controls some of the most important aspects of the nervous system, especially related to stress. So remember, we had talked about homeostasis before. So homeostasis is controlled by the hypothalamus, and we will delve deeper into it in a bit. So this limbic system that I was talking about, this middle part of the brain, okay, that's typically is described as the limbic system, and the rest, the outside part, is called cerebral cortex. I think I did mention that. So most of the advanced complex thinking, processing information, this is happening at the cerebral cortex level. Different regions will have different areas that processes different kind of information, but the entire outside gray matter of the brain, that is referred to as the cerebral cortex. So I thought I had cerebral cortex. Okay, so this is what I was referring to as the different main parts of the cerebral cortex. Now, we are talking about the cerebral cortex at a really bird's eye view level. The broad overgeneralizations. We are not going into the specific detailed parts. But first thing, before we go into the parts, is that cerebral cortex is the most evolved part of our brain, right? So the higher the animal is on the evolutionary spectrum, the more evolved the cerebral cortex will be. The lower order animals will not have an advanced or an evolved cerebral cortex, because the cerebral cortex is the overall part of the brain that does a lot of complex, especially thinking kind of functions. Now, if we go into the specific lobes, we have the frontal part of the brain. Frontal lobe, it's also referred to as, especially this area is called the prefrontal cortex. So this is referred to as the executive center of the brain. So it does all the planning, it does all the complex problem solving, the critical thinking skills, the creative thinking skills. So this is the part of the brain that is most evolved in human beings, and that is the reason we are at the apex when it comes to the evolutionary scheme of things. That is the reason we dominate this planet. So this is the part of the brain that is most evolved. Now, towards the end of the prefrontal cortex, this region is the motor cortex. Motor cortex is the part that is responsible for the control of our movement. So the motor cortex. Then there is the Broca's area, which is essentially responsible for speech production. So complex language production part. So the temporal lobe is more associated with understanding part, the comprehension part of language. But the Broca's area, the frontal lobe, again, without going into specific details, is more responsible for production of language, the speech part. Okay. So let's go to the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is mostly about so this region, so this again just behind the motor cortex is the somatosensory cortex. So this is the part of the brain that receives all the primary sensory information that is coming to our brain. Then from somatosensory cortex to motor cortex, they are adjacent to each other, right? So information can quickly go from receiving the information, and quickly the brain can direct information, and this is what you do. This is you run, you jump, or whatever. So the motor cortex is just next to it. The motor cortex will then send the signal to do whatever needs to be done. Parietal lobe is also responsible for our spatial intelligence, knowing where, navigating maps, those kinds of parietal lobe. Our spatial orientation. For example, I can close my eyes and I can touch my tip of my forefinger. So even without seeing, the seeing part is controlled by the occipital lobe, right? But even without seeing, my brain could tell through sensory information. Information came to my brain and said where my left hand's forefinger is, and my right hand could go and touch it without even thinking about it, right? So this is without seeing it. So there is the spatial memory, that's spatial orientation. Those things are controlled by the parietal lobe. And temporal lobe, mostly hearing, language. Occipital lobe, I said, visual processing of information, and temporal lobe is more processing of sound. Okay. So one quick thing, I did mention the somatosensory cortex, where information is received through our sensory nerves, and then direction goes to the motor cortex for us to do what we need to do. Important thing to note here, that certain parts of our body have bigger connection to these somatosensory cortex and motor cortex. Like our hand, for example, when it comes to our sensation, our lips, our tongue, they are much more sensitive. So larger areas of the somatosensory cortex, for example, have connections to our lips and tongue. They are very sensitive. Similarly, in the motor cortex, we have larger connection to our hands, our fingers. That's the reason we have these fine motor abilities. We, for example, do not have as many connections in our back or on our butt, even if information is coming from those areas, right? That's the reason, for example, when they give you an injection, they often give you injection on your butt. Why? Because that area is not as sensitive. Whereas imagine if you were given injection on the tip of your nail, that would be excruciatingly painful. Why? Because we have greater senses, greater sensation connected to the somatosensory cortex, right? So this reminds me, you may have seen in certain religions where they self-flagellate, right? Why don't they self-flagellate, hitting their nails, or because that would be much more painful. It's easier to flagellate your back where we have fewer nerve endings, and which is also having fewer areas connected to the somatosensory cortex. Again, this is not to make fun of any religion as such, because probably this practice exists in many religions. But just to illustrate how our brain functions, and then how it is related to the experiences that we have, as well as why certain things are more common than others. In any case, now we will go into the limbic system. This is the part that is most crucial to stress, the experience of stress, and for that matter, later on, management of stress. It has these 4 main parts. The thalamus, again, I have briefly talked about it, the hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. These are the 4 main parts here. Okay, there are other parts, but corpus callosum is it's the connective tissue that connects both the hemispheres. So these all will come under the limbic system, but the most important parts are thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. So it's important that you remember these 4 parts of the limbic system, because they have some unique functions which I will describe in a bit, but it is important that you remember these parts if you are not remembering many of the other complexities. And the easy way to remember is this hat. So this is the hat of a hippopotamus, right? So the easy way to remember is hippo, okay, hat, H-A-T. So hippocampus, hypothalamus, amygdala, thalamus. That's a easy way to remember these 4 main parts of the limbic system. So we will start with the hippocampus. The hippocampus, so again, it's in this is all in the middle part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that essentially processes our short-term memories into long-term memories. Okay, so memory is stored everywhere for that matter, but the hippocampus plays a critical role in processing the short-term memories into long-term memories. And it is also a critical part in our motivation. So how motivated you will be. And again, you remember that limbic system is the part that I said that is most affected and most affected by stress, and it is also the part that is the most important when it comes to recognizing threat in the environment. So that's the reason it is the most important part when it comes to stress. Again, I think I should take even another back step here. Remember, I told you the cortex is the most advanced part of the brain, the most conscious thinking part of the brain. This basal ganglia is underneath the cortex. So if this is the brain, basal ganglia is in the middle. So that is the part that is most is the closest to the brain stem. So what happened? Okay, that is the part that is the closest to the brain stem. So especially when it comes to threats, we should, especially if it is a real danger, we should be able to register that threat the fastest, so that then we can take the necessary action for our survival, right? So that is the reason the limbic system is the part that is, you will see even in reptiles, right? They recognize a threat and then they take necessary action. The snake will bring up his hood or whatever, so that to respond to the threat that they have. So that's the limbic system. So in any case, the parts of the limbic system then has great impact on the experience of stress, as well as if these parts are damaged in certain way, then it will have huge negative impact on your functioning. So as I said, the hippocampus, it's something that converts the short-term memory into long-term memory. It is responsible for that processing, and it is responsible for motivation. Now, what often do we see when people are stressed, especially prolonged stress? They lose motivation. When they get depressed, they lose motivation, because the hippocampus part of the brain is getting affected. And you, especially as you are studying something, you are not being able to remember it. So your memorizing capacity becomes affected as well. So this is again because of the hippocampus. Now another thing, why did I say that stress impacts the hippocampus in a significant way? Because hippocampus has the highest number of what we call our glucocorticoid receptors. In simple term, it has the highest concentration of cortisol receptor. Cortisol is a stress hormone that I will talk about in my next lecture. So if you are suffering from long-term stress, cortisol is the stress hormone that is especially related to long-term chronic kind of stress. Okay, so if your body has a high amount of cortisol, what is going to happen is that the hippocampus part of the brain is going to be damaged, which then will impact your motivation. So you may become depressed. You may not feel the motivation to try things, even if you know what's the right thing to do. You know it's right, but you don't feel the motivation to go and exercise, for example. Then you have difficulty remembering things. Okay. This is something interesting. It also makes you fat. There is a syndrome called Cushing's syndrome, which is essentially a problem that happens because of the body having too much of cortisol. The entire body has too much of cortisol. This could be because of somebody experiencing a lot of stress over a long period of time, but it could also happen because of other damages to the endocrine system, due to which there is excess secretion of cortisol that may be happening. But in either case, what happens is that you have these problems of memory, you have these problems with motivation, and not just that. Let me actually take you. Yes. So you develop this kind of body shape. You get rashes, you get high blood pressure, high blood sugar, so diabetes. So this is the kind of body shape that you develop when you have Cushing's syndrome. So it is also referred to as hypercortisolism. cortisolism, because there is excess amount of cortisol and it damages the hippocampus. And this tends to be more common in women than it is in men. So again, it is important then that we take care as to not get into chronic stress, because again, at a structural level, our different parts of our brain gets damaged. So now let's go to the thalamus. I think I already mentioned that it's this relay center, right? It relays information, and it's also related to the waking center. So we start developing sleep disorders if we our body is constantly stressed, right? We get insomnia, or we may oversleep. So it can happen in different kind of directions. So let's go to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, I said, is the part of the brain that is responsible for homeostasis. It actually regulates the ANS referring to autonomic nervous system. So hypothalamus is one of the most critical part of the limbic system, because it sends out information that leads to the secretion of the different hormones that are related to stress. Okay, the epinephrine, norepinephrine, or what you may know in common parlance as adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and so on and so forth. So the hypothalamus is also responsible for our sleep cycle. So what is referred to as the circadian rhythm. So we all tend to go to bed at a certain period of time, then we tend to wake up at a certain period of time, and this typically is related to the light in the atmosphere, right? So we tend to, unless we have jobs that make us work at night and sleep during the day, typically most of us will be awake during the day when there is bright sunlight, and we will go to bed in the night. So if the hypothalamus gets damaged, then our sleep cycle, the typical circadian rhythm, gets impacted. And I will actually create a separate video on this. There's a lot of details that we need to cover there. But for now, understand that hypothalamus is the part that is responsible for this. And if it is damaged, which can happen, especially if we are having prolonged stress, then so hypothalamus actually has two parts. The hypothalamus has two parts. So there is it's a small part in the brain, but it has the back part, which is, I think, controls the parasympathetic nervous system, and the front part which controls the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. The front back, I don't remember for sure, or it may be vice versa. But important thing to remember is that within this small hypothalamus, there is it controls both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, right? So threat in the environment, or your sympathetic nervous system gets to an overdrive. Threat reduces, your parasympathetic nervous system goes into a drive, and sympathetic nervous system comes down. So this balance, this homeostasis, is maintained by hypothalamus. That's the reason I said this is critical to homeostasis. So we have to be very cognizant of the importance of hypothalamus here. The last part, though not the least important, is the amygdala. Okay, amygdala is again another small part here next to the hippocampus. This is the part that senses danger. This is the part that receives the first information about there being any kind of threat. So this is the alarm center. It's like if there's a fire in the building, the fire alarm goes up, right? So that's the sign that there is some danger and something needs to be done. So similar is the analogy for the amygdala. So anytime you perceive any threat, the part of the brain that registers at first is the amygdala. Amygdala, I think the origin of the word is to do with, it's shaped like an almond. So that's the reason it is called the amygdala. But in any case, so this is the part that is most essential for these emotions: anger, violence, fear, anxiety. So if you activate the amygdala, so that's the reason I have these plus signs. You will be more fearful, you will be more angry, you will be more anxious, you will be more violent if we activate the amygdala. Okay, because you are seeing the threat and you are fearful, you are angry, you are ready to fight or flight, right? When the amygdala is deactivated, what we see is that you feel no fear at all. That is, you are you are not at all violent. Now, of course, so amygdala needs to function optimally in order for us to survive. But there are certain syndromes where either the amygdala has been removed, or there is some damage to the amygdala, due to which the amygdala is not sufficiently stimulated. And during those times, what we see is something called as the Clover-Bucy syndrome. Okay, I have slides related to this later on. In my next video, I will talk about it. But people who have a deactivated amygdala, they tend to be completely disinhibited. Okay, they don't have any fear. The animals, they will even take a venomous snake and put it in their mouth, which will then kill them. But they have absolutely no sense of what is dangerous. So we tend to see they also becoming hypersexual. They have completely disinhibited. So people suffering from anxiety may have a overactive amygdala. Okay. And in fact, some of the anti-anxiety drugs that are given, like the benzodiazepine, acts on the amygdala. But it's a very dangerous drug. In fact, I don't know how many of you have heard of Professor Jordan Peterson, who is a professor at University of Toronto. He's a clinical psychologist, extremely famous for the last book sold like several millions, 12 Laws of Success or something. 12 Laws of Life or something to that effect was the title of the book that sold into millions. But in any case, the reason I'm mentioning about him, he suffered from anxiety. He had some problems in the family as well. His wife was suffering from cancer and other difficulties. He had some health problems. So he was suffering from anxiety, and the psychiatrist that he went to, they prescribed him very small doses of benzodiazepine. Later on, when his wife developed cancer and he had more problems, they increased the dosage. And this drug is not supposed to be taken for more than a week or two. But he then developed a drug dependency, benzodiazepine, and he literally died from this bodily addiction that happened to benzodiazepine. So he had to be in the ICU for over a month, and he literally lost 1 or 2 years of his life because of the negative effect of benzodiazepine. So why am I talking about this? We have to be then very careful what drugs we take to manage our anxiety, for instance, our depression, for instance, because many of these drugs, they help us because they affect the limbic system. But because they affect the limbic system, they can also potentially damage our limbic system. So we have to be extremely careful when we are taking any kind of drugs, be it alcohol, be it prescribed drugs. So it needs to be taken under proper guidance under the proper guidance of competent authority. We should never be self-medicating, especially when it comes to these stress-related issues. So I hope you are understanding, because it does impact the brain in significant ways that can potentially be irreversible. It can literally damage the structural part of the brain, which then can mess you up for the rest of your life. So that's something that we should all be cognizant about. So with one last point, the olfactory bulb. This is the smell part of olfactory bulb. It's a small part again, at the front part of the brain, closer to our nose. So it is related to our experience of smell and sexual behavior. Our sexuality, again, you will realize, has a lot to do with our sense of smell, right? People whom we get attracted to and people whom we are not attracted to or disgusted by, everything. The sense of smell also has a lot of this actually leads to one more point that I quickly want to touch upon before I stop this lecture. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight, and parasympathetic is the rest and digest, right? If you remember the diagrams that I had for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, I don't think I have it here in this slide, but it is also related to our sexual activation. This limbic system is also related to our procreation. When I see some attractive girl walking by, limbic system will get activated then. Okay, so it is not just threat; it is also the attractiveness of sexual stimuli, which impacts the limbic system. But in any case, we will touch upon some of those topics later on. I will have one more video related to the biology of stress, which is going to be much more simple than this one. So the complex part, the anatomy part, we have mostly dealt with. The only part that is slightly still a little bit complex is the endocrine system, the different hormones, but that is still pretty easy. So we have covered the most difficult part. In the next video, I will summarize everything that we have gone through so far and its implication, especially with respect to stress and stress management. So with that, thank you.